Hello and welcome to my channel NBSoundHopperUK, and the subject of this video will be 6 loads of old pony. In accumulating over 2,000 albums, it's inevitable that I've come to regard some as being duds. It doesn't necessarily mean that I dislike all the tracks. Many have at least one track that I think is great, but overall the album doesn't seem to hold together well. It could be that the recording sounds like it was made in a hurry, with corners being cut in order to get it released quickly. Tracks might seem sloppily arranged, or that they don't all really belong together on the same album. There are lots of potential reasons for an album not necessarily resonating. That's a bit of context, so I'll get straight on to what I think of as being 6 or far from the best that I own. First up is Houses of the Holy by Led Zeppelin from 1973. Try as I might, I just don't get on with this album. For starters, Robert Plant doesn't seem to find many good vocal lines. For example, opening track The Song Remains the Same has him inanely wailing far too much for my liking, and when he sings Oh Darling, Darling, Darling on Over the Hills and Far Away, the pseudo-Irish lilt in his voice makes me want to cringe. He's not the only culprit, though, as some of the songwriting generally is poor, and more prominent use of keyboards detracts from most songs where they are used. If the Rain song manages to succeed at anything, it is to sound as dreary as the song title's imagery. Guitar and drums combine together well on No Quarter, but on the whole the track has the air of something more ambitious than they were capable of delivering on at the time. John Bonham was an excellent rock drummer, but should have done a bit more homework for the grunge and Jamaica. He didn't really have a feel for funk or reggae and doesn't come anywhere close to sounding convincing. Dancing Days is probably my favourite track, but even then the weedy keyboards almost spoil it. The guitar riff for The Ocean is decent, but I think the Beastie Boys used it to better effect when sampled for their track She's Crafty. This is a tired sounding album, and if I'm in a charitable mood, I'd still only give it a 4 out of 10 rating. My second selection is Tomato by Yes from 1978. To be fair to Chris Squire and Alan White, they both made solid contributions here. I can't say the same for John Anderson, Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman though. Starting with John Anderson, his lyrics fluctuate between almost customary vagueness and absolute pap, and there's some dreadful stuff amongst the latter. Given that this was released in 1978, the use of an expression like dig it on Don't Kill the Whale wasn't nearly as cool as Anderson might have thought. Rock is the medium of our generation, he sings on Release, a feeble attempt at trying to get edgy, backed with Steve Howe's lame riffing. Circus of Heaven? I can't find sufficient words to describe how bad I think it is. Tomato appears to suffer as a consequence of the success Yes had with Wondrous Stories, resulting in shorter form tracks in the main. The problem is, without the additional space they previously afforded themselves, it's like Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman are fighting over the same territory, and all too often it becomes a mess. I have the expanded CD version of Tomato, and the quality of the previously unreleased tracks that might have appeared later had Anderson stayed are such that Yes dodged a bullet by getting Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes in to replace Anderson and Wakeman for their next album, Drama, a significant improvement. My third pick is TRB2 by the Tom Robinson Band from 1979. Tom Robinson Band's debut, Power in the Darkness, was a great album of its genre, which captured many issues of the day in 1978. TRB2, by contrast, is a shambles. Having found themselves on the treadmill of touring and then needing to get new material sorted out, TRB2 sounds like a bunch of hastily written and half-baked songs, despite some admirable sentiments. Ian Quince Parker had replaced Mark Amber on keyboards, and Preston Heyman had replaced drummer Dolphin Taylor, but neither adequately filled the shoes of their predecessors. Todd Rundgren might have been able to get the recording turned around quickly, but that's all he brings to proceedings. In the end, the songs fail to build on the debut, and In places, the songwriting resorts to weakly aping techniques used on Power in the Darkness. Sorry, Mr. Harris being the most notable example. Bully for You is probably the standout track, co-written by Peter Gabriel, but on its own, it's not enough to save this album. A sad end for the band. Fourth is Now Then by Stiff Little Fingers from 1982. I think Stiff Little Fingers had pretty much run their course by this, their fourth studio album. Another band who, with Inflammable Material, had an excellent debut a few years earlier, but the truth was that by 1982 they were in decline and unable to see beyond their influences and carve out a sound that was distinctly their own. They were hanging on to the coattails of The Clash and not making a very good job of it. When it comes to the lyrics, The Clash were able to use theirs as a form of social commentary. Stiff Little Fingers on Now Then just come across as sententious, moralising, and even patronising. To name but 6 of the 11 tracks on the album, Touch and Go, Stands to Reason, The Price of Admission, Welcome to the Whole Week, Bits of Kids, and Is That What You Fought the War For, all feel like lectures. Won't Be Told and Talk Back both sound like Stiff Little Fingers going down the rebellious path as a matter of routine, punk by numbers. The world was moving on and Stiff Little Fingers had been left behind, basically. Fifth, Choose Your Masks by Hawkwind, another one from 1982. Line-up changes were frequent in Hawkwind. Unfortunately, by the early 1980s, it was clear that the newer members of the band were not of the same creative calibre as those who had departed. Dave Brock, Hawkwind's mainstay guitarist, was now chief vocalist and lyricist, but he was no Robert Calvert. Harvey Bainbridge on bass was a pale shadow of Lemmy. Brock and Bainbridge had also taken over synth duties as well, but fell way short of the standard Simon House had previously set. Hugh Lloyd Langton as lead guitarist was okay if you didn't mind a poor David Gilmour impersonation. As the band's core members, this was their fourth album. Levitation and Sonic Attack were passable at best. The more experimental Church of Hawkwind was a much better effort. Choose Your Masks, though, I find weak. As a Hawkwind fan, I don't mind the use of sci-fi lyrics, but without an allegory connecting them to an issue relevant when the tracks were recorded, they can be a bit boring. Synths reduced to a spacey sound effect are equally so. If the updated version of Sonic Attack on the album of the same name was difficult to stomach, then the new version of Silver Machine on Choose Your Masks is garbage. The title track is a bad example of what was becoming an almost formulaic Hawkwind album opener. Solitary Mind Games, written and sung by Lloyd Langton, has an excruciatingly poor lyric, a load of guff masquerading as sophistication. Thankfully, in the mid-80s, Alan Davey joined the band on bass, a much more creative force for Dave Brockettell to work alongside, and their albums improved greatly. As far as this album is concerned, nah. And the final selection is number 10, Upping Street by Big Audio Dynamite from 1986. When Mick Jones left The Clash to form Big Audio Dynamite, they hit the ground running with their 1985 debut, This Is Big Audio Dynamite. It had catchy tunes containing excellent samples and overall an awareness of how more pop-leaning rock music was changing. The follow-up, number 10, Upping Street, is, alas, dull and lifeless for the most part. Starting with Come On Every Beatbox, it exudes an air of the band being seduced by an overblown sense of their own coolness. V13 strikes me as similar, but there are several tracks that I find even worse. Beyond the Pale, Sambadrome, Ticket, Limbo the Law, and Hollywood Boulevard all fall flat and, dare I say it, are indicative of a general lack of effort. The fact that many of these tracks were co-written by Jones's ex-Clash bandmate Joe Strummer merely provides evidence that as a songwriting team, their best days were a long way behind them. Final track, Sight CMC, is the only track to buck that particular trend, but having to endure the prior 34 or so minutes makes it far too little too late. Possibly there was record company pressure to strike while the iron was hot following the success of This Is Big Audio Dynamite. If that was their intention, it turned out to be a miserable failure. In the end, of course, it's all a matter of preference. What sounds awful to one person might be a classic album to someone else, and that's fine. However, to summarise my thoughts on these albums, I'll quote from the lyric of the track King Bing by Babybird. When will people realise that if you put shit on the dance set and spin it at 45 RPM, 120 BPM, you'll still hear it stink? It's rather sadistic of me, but in the description for this video, I've included links to some of the tracks that I've mentioned. Feedback and subscription options are shown above, and if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.